April 19, 1809. A Portuguese artillery captain stands behind his guns watching 40,000 French veterans bearing down on his position. Marshal Masséna, Napoleon's dear child of victory, commands the French II Corps, the finest troops in Europe. Facing them, 4,000 Allied soldiers, outnumbered 10 to 1, with nowhere to retreat. Captain Thomas de Souza of the Portuguese Royal Artillery has 12 cannon and crews who've never faced odds like this. His job is simple and impossible. Hold this position long enough for the Allied army to survive. What happens in the next 8 hours will break Napoleon's best corps through mathematics, timing, and nerves of steel. This is the story of how one artillery officer's tactical genius defeated overwhelming force, changed a campaign, and then vanished from history. If you want to discover how technical brilliance can triumph over impossible odds, hit that like button and subscribe, because this battle deserves to be remembered. Spring 1809 brought renewed hope to Napoleon's enemies. Austria, humiliated at Austerlitz 3 years earlier, had rebuilt its army and declared war in April, forming the Fifth Coalition against French dominance. Archduke Charles, Austria's ablest commander, led 200,000 troops into Bavaria, catching Napoleon's forces dispersed across Europe. The emperor himself was in Paris when war erupted, leaving Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff, brilliant at administration but mediocre in field command, temporarily in charge of French forces in Germany. The French II Corps, commanded by Marshal André Masséna, represented Napoleon's elite striking force. Masséna had earned his nickname L'Enfant Chéri de la Victoire, the dear child of victory, through a career of stunning successes from Italy to Austria. His 40,000 veterans had marched from Madrid to Moscow, feared across Europe for their discipline, firepower, and aggressive tactics. These weren't conscripts, these were professional soldiers who'd won battles on 3 continents. Against this juggernaut, Austria fielded its reorganized army alongside a curious contingent: Portuguese troops. Portugal, occupied by France until British intervention in 1808, had contributed forces to the Allied cause. These Portuguese soldiers had undergone radical reform under British advisors, particularly Marshal William Beresford, who'd restructured their entire military establishment. Portuguese artillery, trained by British gunners, had developed a reputation for technical proficiency that exceeded their small nation's expectations. The strategic situation in Bavaria was fluid and dangerous. Archduke Charles sought to defeat French forces piecemeal before Napoleon could arrive and concentrate his scattered armies. Masséna's II Corps represented a critical French element, large enough to threaten Austrian communications, experienced enough to hold ground until reinforcements arrived. The Austrians needed to contain or destroy this corps quickly. Near the town of Landshut, where the river Isar wound through Bavarian hills, an Allied force found itself in Masséna's path. The Allied commander, accounts vary on whether this was an Austrian general or a mixed command, had perhaps 4,000 troops, Austrian infantry, Portuguese contingent, and cavalry screens. Intelligence reported Masséna approaching with his entire corps. The mathematics were brutal: 4,000 against 40,000, 10 to 1 odds. In Napoleonic warfare, where massed columns and concentrated firepower decided battles, such disparities usually meant annihilation. The Allied force couldn't simply retreat. Strategic necessities required buying time. Every hour Masséna spent here was an hour he wasn't reinforcing other French positions. Every French casualty inflicted was one less soldier Napoleon could field when he arrived. The mission was clear: delay Masséna, inflict maximum damage, preserve the Allied force if possible. Survival seemed unlikely. Victory seemed impossible. Command of the Portuguese artillery battery fell to Captain Thomas de Souza. He had perhaps 12 guns. Accounts suggest a mix of 6-pounders and possibly some 12-pounder pieces, mobile field artillery designed for rapid deployment and sustained fire. His crews numbered around 150 men: gunners, matrosses who hauled ammunition, drivers for the horse teams. These men would need to face Masséna's massed artillery and 40,000 infantry. On the evening of April 18th, as French campfires appeared on the horizon, the Allied force prepared defensive positions. The terrain offered some advantage. Hills that could conceal artillery, a river protecting one flank, roads that channeled French approaches. But terrain alone wouldn't stop Masséna's veterans. De Souza studied the ground, calculating angles and ranges, choosing positions for his guns. Everything depended on where he placed those 12 cannon and how he used them. In 8 hours, the French would attack. And then the mathematics of artillery would decide everything. Thomas de Souza came from Portugal's emerging class of professional artillery officers, men who'd survived the crucible of military reform that followed the French invasion of 1807. When Napoleon's forces had occupied Portugal, the royal family fled to Brazil, but they left behind a military establishment in desperate need of modernization. British intervention in 1808 brought not just liberation, but transformation. Marshal William Beresford arrived with a mandate to rebuild the Portuguese army from foundations upward, and artillery received particular attention. Portuguese gunners trained under British instructors who brought rigorous standards from the Royal Artillery. Unlike infantry, where courage and discipline sufficed, artillery demanded mathematics. Gunners calculated trajectories, estimated ranges, adjusted for wind and elevation. They needed to understand the physics of ballistics, the chemistry of gunpowder, the engineering of cannon design. This made artillery an educated arm of service, attracting officers with technical aptitude rather than just aristocratic pedigree. De Souza had likely served in the chaotic campaigns of 1808 and early 1809, learning his trade under fire. Portuguese artillery had proven surprisingly effective during the Peninsular War's opening phases, earning British respect through accurate fire and steady nerve. The guns themselves were decent. Portuguese foundries produced serviceable bronze cannon, though not matching French or British quality. What distinguished Portuguese artillery was crew drill and fire discipline, areas where British training showed results. By 1809, a Portuguese artillery captain commanded respect based on demonstrated competence. De Souza would have been in his late 20s or early 30s, old enough for experience, young enough for the physical demands of campaign life. His battery, 12 guns with full ammunition wagons, spare equipment, and horse teams, represented significant investment and trust. Portuguese contingents in Allied armies were small, making each unit's performance matter enormously for national credibility. Personality-wise, artillery officers tended toward methodical temperaments. You couldn't fire cannon by instinct or passion. You calculated, measured, timed. De Souza would have been comfortable with numbers, patient with detail, calm under pressure. These weren't romantic cavalry officers charging with sabers drawn. These were technicians who killed from hundreds of yards away through mathematical precision. His relationship with Allied command likely combined cooperation with cultural friction. Portuguese officers served alongside Austrians, who sometimes viewed them as junior partners from a small, recently occupied nation. But competent artillery always earned respect. Good gunners saved infantry lives and won battles. De Souza probably had autonomy in tactical decisions regarding his battery's deployment, a trust earned through previous reliability. He understood French tactics intimately. Masséna's corps employed the standard French system: massed columns for attack, artillery preparation before infantry assault, aggressive pursuit of broken enemies. French doctrine emphasized momentum and moral shock: hit hard, hit fast, overwhelm through concentration. Against such tactics, artillery offered the best equalizer. Infantry in line could deliver disciplined volleys, but artillery could break columns before they closed, disrupt formations at distance, create casualties that sapped morale. The night before battle, De Souza would have inspected his guns, checked ammunition supplies, briefed his gun captains. 12 cannon against Masséna's artillery park of perhaps 60 or 80 guns. 12 cannon to support 4,000 infantry against 40,000. The mathematics were impossible. But mathematics was precisely De Souza's specialty, and he'd learned something British gunners emphasized. Positioning mattered more than numbers. Place guns correctly, use terrain wisely, concentrate fire intelligently, and 12 cannon could do the work of 50. Tomorrow would test whether he'd learned those lessons well enough to survive what was coming. Marshal André Masséna was 51 years old in 1809 and had spent 3 decades proving he was one of history's finest battlefield commanders. Born to modest circumstances in Nice, he'd risen through revolutionary France's armies purely through talent and aggression. Napoleon himself called Masséna the greatest name of his military empire, praise the emperor rarely bestowed. His nickname, the dear child of victory, captured how fortune seemed to favor his audacious tactics and relentless pursuit of defeated enemies. His corps in spring 1809 represented French military power at its peak. The Second Corps comprised 4 full infantry divisions, plus supporting cavalry and artillery, roughly 40,000 men organized into veteran regiments that had campaigned from the Atlantic to the Danube. These weren't raw conscripts hastily trained and thrust into battle. These were professional soldiers who'd survived years of warfare, men who knew their trade and trusted their commanders. The divisions included legendary units, the 4th Light Infantry, the 15th Line Infantry, regiments whose battle honors stretched back through Austerlitz, Jena, and the Italian campaigns. Officers had risen through merit in an army that promoted based on competence rather than birth. NCOs were hard men who maintained discipline through respect earned under fire. The rank and file could march 30 kilometers in a day, deploy from column to line under artillery fire, and execute complex maneuvers that less experienced armies couldn't attempt. Masséna's artillery park dwarfed anything the Allies could field. French doctrine emphasized massed artillery fires, concentrating guns to blast holes in enemy lines before infantry assault. His corps artillery likely numbered 60 to 80 pieces, 6-pounders for mobility, 12-pounders for destructive power, perhaps some heavier siege guns if the campaign required them. French gunners were competent professionals who understood their weapons and could deliver sustained, accurate fire. Tactically, French forces employed the system that had conquered Europe, the ordre mixte, mixing columns for shock with lines for firepower. Infantry advanced in battalion columns, drums beating, officers at the front, moving with frightening speed and cohesion. When they hit enemy lines, the psychological impact of thousands of men arriving in dense formation often broke resistance before bayonets crossed. If the enemy held, French columns could deploy into line and exchange volleys. Though this wasn't their preference, columns were about momentum and moral effect. Masséna's command style combined careful planning with opportunistic aggression. He studied ground, identified enemy weaknesses, then struck with overwhelming force at the decisive point. Once he achieved breakthrough, he pursued relentlessly, turning retreat into rout into annihilation. Enemies who stood and fought might inflict casualties, but ultimately fell to superior numbers and firepower. Enemies who ran were hunted down by cavalry and destroyed. His recent record reinforced this reputation. The Second Corps had fought successfully throughout the 1809 campaign's opening weeks, defeating smaller Austrian forces, securing key positions in Bavaria. Morale was high. The soldiers trusted Masséna, knowing his tactical skill kept casualties lower than less competent commanders achieved. They expected to win, because they usually did. Against the 4,000 Allied troops near Landshut, Masséna's approach was straightforward. Deploy overwhelming force, blast them with artillery, assault with massed columns, pursue the broken remnants. The operation should take hours, not days. Austrian and Portuguese forces might fight with courage, but courage without numbers was just a prelude to defeat. What Masséna couldn't know was that the Portuguese artillery captain studying terrain and calculating firing angles understood something fundamental. In warfare, positioning and precision could sometimes trump numerical superiority. Not often, not reliably. But sometimes, with perfect execution and desperate courage, 12 guns could do what 40,000 men couldn't achieve. Stop them. Dawn on April 19th brought clear skies and the certainty of battle. French campfires had multiplied through the night as Masséna's divisions concentrated. Dark columns of infantry visible in the morning light, cavalry squadrons forming on the flanks, artillery trains rumbling into position. The Allied force, dug in on rising ground near Landshut, watched 40,000 men deploying with the precision that made French arms feared across Europe. The terrain offered modest advantages. A series of low ridges provided elevated positions for artillery, commanding fields of fire across approaches the French would need to use. The River Isar protected the Allied right flank, its bridges already destroyed to prevent French envelopment. Roads converged from the south and west, natural avenues for French columns advancing to contact. Between the ridges and the roads lay open ground, killing zones if artillery could dominate them. De Souza had positioned his 12 guns with mathematical care. 4 pieces occupied the central ridge, sighted to cover the main road. 4 more deployed on a secondary ridge to the left, angled to deliver enfilade fire, shooting down the length of advancing columns rather than into their frontal face, maximizing casualties per shot. The final 4 guns remained in reserve behind the ridges, ready to shift wherever crisis developed. This wasn't standard practice. Most commanders deployed all guns in line, but de Souza understood flexibility would matter against such overwhelming odds. Allied infantry, perhaps 3,000 Austrian and Portuguese foot soldiers, held positions along the ridges and in a small village anchoring the center. They'd constructed hasty fieldworks, earth parapets, timber abatis, but nothing that would stop determined assault. Their job was surviving the initial French artillery bombardment, then holding long enough for de Souza's guns to break French momentum. If the infantry line collapsed too quickly, artillery would be overrun before making decisive impact. French deployment proceeded with textbook efficiency. Masséna's divisions formed 3 massive columns, each perhaps 10,000 strong, aimed at different sectors of the Allied line. His artillery, at least 60 guns, rolled forward to bombardment positions roughly 800 yards from Allied ridges. French doctrine called for preliminary bombardment to soften defenses, then infantry assault under covering fire. Masséna had overwhelming superiority in both artillery and infantry. This should be straightforward. At approximately 7 o'clock, French guns opened fire. The sound was physically stunning. 60 cannon discharging in sequence, a rolling thunder that echoed off hills and river valley. Solid shots screamed overhead, smashing into ridgeline positions, throwing up fountains of earth. Allied infantry huddled behind their earthworks as cannonballs ploughed through formations, killing men or maiming them with the casual brutality of physics. De Souza held fire. His guns had shorter range than French 12-pounders, and wasting ammunition in ineffective counter-battery duels was pointless. Better to wait, absorb the bombardment, preserve shot for infantry targets. His crews crouched beside their guns, watching French columns begin their advance through the smoke of their own artillery. This was the moment. French infantry moving forward in dense columns, drums beating cadence, thousands of men in synchronized movement. They'd cover the 800 yards in perhaps 15 minutes at standard march pace. During those 15 minutes, de Souza's 12 guns needed to inflict enough casualties to break their momentum, shatter their cohesion, make them hesitate. The Allied commander gave the order. Infantry would hold fire until French reached 200 yards. Artillery could engage immediately. De Souza walked behind his gun line, checked each piece's elevation and training, then gave the command his crews had waited for. Fire! The Portuguese guns spoke in controlled sequence, not the ragged crash of panicked fire, but the measured reports of professional artillery. De Souza's central battery fired first. 4 6-pounders at roughly 700 yards range, targeting the French column advancing on the main road. Solid shot, 6-pound iron balls moving faster than sound, plunged into the dense formation. At that range, a well-aimed ball could pass through a dozen men before kinetic energy dissipated, leaving a corridor of shattered bodies through the column's depth. French drums faltered momentarily, then resumed. Officers closed ranks, maintaining formation discipline. The column kept advancing. But de Souza's enfilade battery now opened fire from the left ridge, shooting down the length of another French column at an angle that maximized destructive effect. Each ball that struck the formation's flank could tear through 20 or 30 men before stopping. The mathematical advantage of enfilade fire, hitting the long axis rather than the narrow front, multiplied each gun's killing power dramatically. French artillery shifted targets, directing counter-battery fire at the Portuguese guns, now revealing their positions through muzzle smoke. 12-pound shot crashed into the ridgeline, seeking to silence the annoying hornets stinging Masséna's advance. One Portuguese gun took a direct hit, the iron ball smashing the barrel off its carriage and killing 2 crew members instantly. The survivors dragged wounded comrades clear, whilst a reserve gun crew manhandled a replacement piece forward. De Souza's gun captains, experienced sergeants commanding each piece, worked their crews with practiced efficiency. The 6-pounder drill was brutally simple, but demanded perfect timing. Sponge the barrel to extinguish embers from the previous shot, load powder cartridge and ball, ram them home, prime the touch hole with fine powder, aim using handspikes to shift the trail and adjust elevation, then fire on command. A trained crew could manage 3 rounds per minute. De Souza's Portuguese gunners, drilled to British standards, could sustain that rate for hours if ammunition held and barrels didn't overheat. The range closed. 600 yards. 500. French columns had absorbed horrific casualties. Gaps torn in their ranks, officers down, files disrupted. But 40,000 men could absorb losses that would shatter smaller forces. They kept coming because stopping meant standing under artillery fire without ability to respond. Forward momentum was survival instinct and tactical necessity. At 400 yards, de Souza ordered the shift to case shot. Thin-walled iron spheres filled with musket balls that burst on firing, turning each cannon into a gigantic shotgun. The effect was devastating at medium range. French front ranks disintegrated under clouds of lead balls. Entire sections of the column simply ceased to exist, replaced by heaps of wounded and dead. The advance slowed, not from decision but from physical necessity. Men climbing over bodies, formation cohesion degrading. But French artillery was finding its mark. A Portuguese gun position took concentrated fire, killing the entire crew and destroying the piece. Another gun's limber, the ammunition wagon, exploded when hit, showering the position with burning debris and fragments. De Souza's battery was down to 9 operational guns, and French columns were still advancing on 3 axes. Allied infantry opened musket fire at 200 yards, adding to the carnage but unable to stop the French through firepower alone. Masséna's columns, bloodied but unbroken, closed to within 100 yards of the Allied line. At that range, de Souza's guns could fire canister, tin cans filled with iron balls that turned cannon into close-range meat grinders. The crisis was arriving faster than mathematics could solve it. At 100 yards, de Souza's remaining guns switched to canister shot, the artilleryman's most lethal weapon at close range. Each canister contained roughly 40 iron balls, each the size of a large grape. When fired, the tin canister disintegrated, spraying its contents in a cone of metal that scythed through formations like an invisible blade. A single canister round could kill or maim 20 men in the dense French columns. 3 rounds per minute per gun meant each of de Souza's 9 operational pieces was inflicting 60 casualties per minute. Theoretically. The reality was more chaotic and more terrible. The leading French column hit the Allied centre with the momentum of 10,000 men who'd marched through hell to reach bayonet range. Portuguese and Austrian infantry delivered point-blank musket volleys, then braced for impact. French soldiers, their blood up from losses suffered during the advance, crashed into the thin Allied line with bayonets and musket butts. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across 100 yards of front, savage personal violence where men stabbed and clubbed each other in formations so compressed that falling wounded had nowhere to collapse. The Allied line bent dangerously. Austrian infantry in the centre gave ground, step by step, fighting desperately but overwhelmed by sheer numbers. If the line broke, French reserves would pour through the gap and the battle would become a massacre. De Souza saw the crisis developing. The central ridge, his primary artillery position, would be overrun within minutes unless something changed the mathematics. He made the decision in seconds. Every gun, regardless of position or current target, would concentrate fire on the French penetration. The left enfilade battery and the reserve guns would shift immediately to support the center, abandoning their positions to mass fires on the single critical point. This violated artillery doctrine. Never abandon a good position, never leave sectors undefended, never concentrate so thoroughly that you can't respond to new threats. De Souza didn't care about doctrine. He cared about breaking that French column in the next 3 minutes, or watching his infantry die. Gun crews limbered their pieces with frantic speed, securing barrels to trails, hooking horse teams, moving at the gallop across broken ground whilst under fire. It was dangerous, verging on suicidal. Artillery moving in the open was desperately vulnerable. Horses were shot, drivers killed, one gun overturned when its wheel hit a crater. But within 5 minutes, 7 Portuguese guns occupied positions on the central ridge, all aimed at the French column, now 60 yards from breakthrough. De Souza gave the command personally, his voice carrying over the battle's roar. 7 guns fired canister in near-simultaneous discharge. The effect was apocalyptic. 280 iron balls, moving at velocities that pulverized bone and shredded flesh, tore through the French column's leading ranks. Men simply disintegrated. The front of the column ceased to exist as an organized formation, replaced by a carpet of bodies 3 deep. The guns reloaded with desperate speed. 18 seconds later, 7 more canister rounds crashed into the reeling column. Then again, and again. In 90 seconds, de Souza's concentrated battery fired 4 full salvos, over 1,000 projectiles, into a target area perhaps 50 yards wide and 10 yards deep. No formation could withstand that. The French column's momentum died, replaced by instinctive self-preservation. Men who'd advanced through artillery fire and musketry broke under the concentrated horror of massed canister at point-blank range. The column recoiled, officers screaming orders that couldn't be heard over screaming wounded and the continuous thunder of Portuguese guns. Allied infantry, sensing the shift, counter-attacked with bayonets, pushing the disorganized French back down the slope. One column stopped, but Masséna had 2 more, and they were still coming. Masséna watched his center column recoil and responded with the cold professionalism that had won him Napoleon's trust. One setback didn't change mathematical reality. He still had overwhelming superiority. His remaining columns would probe the Allied flanks, whilst his artillery suppressed those troublesome Portuguese guns. Then he'd commit his reserves and break this stubborn resistance through sheer weight of metal and men. French 12-pounders concentrated fire on de Souza's exposed battery. The central ridge, now crowded with 7 Portuguese guns and their crews, became a target-rich environment. Solid shot ploughed through the position, dismounting guns, killing crews, creating chaos. One direct hit struck a gun's powder charge at the precise moment of loading, detonating the entire ammunition supply and vaporizing the crew in a flash of fire. Another gun took a ball through its carriage, rendering it immobile. Within 10 minutes of concentrated counter-battery fire, de Souza was down to 5 operational pieces. Meanwhile, French columns advanced on both flanks. The southern column, 12,000 strong, marched against the Allied left, where Portuguese infantry held a village and sparse fieldworks. The northern column, slightly smaller, aimed to turn the Allied right flank near the river. Masséna's plan was elementary, but effective. Pin the center with artillery, crush the flanks with infantry, then exploit whichever breakthrough came first. De Souza faced an impossible calculus. 5 guns, 3 threatened sectors, French artillery making his current position untenable. His crews were exhausted. 3 hours of sustained firing, hauling ammunition, serving guns under bombardment. Barrels were dangerously hot from continuous discharge, affecting accuracy and risking premature detonation of powder charges. Ammunition was depleting. Each gun had perhaps 20 rounds remaining, maybe 30 minutes of sustained fire at current rates. And the French kept coming with what seemed like infinite reserves of men and shells. The southern French column reached the village held by Portuguese infantry. Street fighting erupted, brutal close combat between houses where artillery couldn't intervene without killing friendly forces. The Portuguese fought with desperate courage, but were being ground down by numerical superiority. The northern column advanced against Austrian infantry, who delivered disciplined volleys, but couldn't stop 10,000 men with musketry alone. De Souza made another unorthodox decision. Rather than splitting his remaining guns to support both threatened flanks, which would scatter them ineffectively, he'd use mobility as a weapon. His guns would shift rapidly between positions, firing several rounds at one target, then limbering and galloping to another position to engage a different threat. The constant movement would create uncertainty about Allied artillery strength, forcing French commanders to hesitate and deploy cautiously. It was exhausting and dangerous. Moving artillery under fire violated every safety principle. But static artillery was being destroyed by French counter-battery fire anyway. At least movement offered the chance of survival and continued effectiveness. The Portuguese gun crews executed this mad ballet with extraordinary discipline. Fire 3 rounds at the northern column, creating casualties and disruption. Limber the guns under French artillery fire. Gallop across the ridgeline to new positions. Unlimber, load and fire 3 rounds at the southern column. Then move again before French gunners could accurately target the new position. French observers reported Portuguese artillery everywhere. On the left, then the center, then the right, then back to the left. Masséna's staff calculated the Allies must have at least 20 guns based on the volume and dispersal of fire. They didn't realize they were seeing the same 5 guns in continuous, desperate motion. But even brilliant improvisation has limits. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Crews were at the edge of physical collapse. Horses were dying from exertion and enemy fire. De Souza had bought hours, inflicted hundreds of casualties, and shattered French confidence. But he couldn't hold forever. De Souza's innovation, this frantic mobility under fire, was achieving something remarkable and completely unintended: psychological dominance over a numerically superior enemy. French battalion commanders, accustomed to calculating artillery threats based on visible gun positions, found themselves facing fire from unexpected directions. Artillery that had been hammering their left flank would suddenly appear on their right, delivering enfilade fire before they could adjust formations. The psychological effect of this unpredictability exceeded the actual casualties inflicted. What de Souza had discovered, almost by accident born of desperation, was a principle that wouldn't be formally codified until decades later. In artillery warfare, perceived strength could matter as much as actual firepower. By keeping his guns in constant motion, he created uncertainty. French officers hesitated before committing reserves, unsure whether that ridge to their flank held 2 guns or 20. Hesitation bred caution. Caution slowed attacks. Slowed attacks gave Allied infantry precious minutes to reorganize, to dress ranks, to prepare for the next assault. The technique demanded extraordinary crew discipline. Limbering a gun under fire, securing the barrel to the trail, hitching horses, moving at speed across broken ground, was dangerous in peacetime exercises. Doing it whilst French artillery sought your position and French skirmishers fired at your crews required nerves that transcended normal courage. One mistake, a horse team panicking, a wheel breaking, a harness snapping, meant losing the gun and probably the crew. De Souza's Portuguese gunners executed these movements with precision that would have impressed British Royal Artillery observers. The crews moved as units, each man knowing his role, anticipating the sequence. Drivers kept horses calm under fire through horsemanship and sheer force of will. Gun captains calculated new firing positions whilst their pieces were still moving, selecting ground that offered cover, fields of fire, and escape routes. This wasn't just bravery. This was trained expertise, operating at the absolute edge of human capability. The effect on French morale was cumulative and corrosive. Masséna's veterans had fought across Europe, but they'd never faced artillery that behaved like this, appearing, firing devastating salvos, then vanishing before counter-battery fire could respond. It violated their tactical expectations. Uncertainty crept into decisions. Battalion commanders requested artillery support before advancing, slowing the French tempo of operations. By early afternoon, the battle had reached stalemate. French forces had advanced, but hadn't broken through. Allied infantry still held their positions, bloodied but intact. De Souza's mobile artillery had exacted a toll that exceeded any reasonable expectation from 5 guns against an entire corps. French casualty estimates would later suggest 1,500 to 2,000 killed and wounded. Staggering losses for what should have been a simple, overwhelming assault. But de Souza was reaching the end of possibility. His 5 remaining guns had perhaps a dozen rounds each, 40 minutes of ammunition at most. Crew casualties meant some pieces were being served by scratch teams, mixing survivors from destroyed guns. Horses were dying from exhaustion and wounds, threatening the mobility that made the whole system work. And French pressure wasn't relenting, just adjusting to the new tactical reality. Then the strategic situation changed. Allied scouts reported developments that transformed the battle's context. Napoleon's main army was approaching from the west, faster than expected. The Allied force needed to disengage immediately or risk encirclement by the Emperor's overwhelming reinforcements. The order came down: general withdrawal. The mission had succeeded. Masséna delayed, casualties inflicted, time purchased. Now came the most dangerous military operation: breaking contact with a superior enemy and conducting a fighting retreat. De Souza had held the line for 8 hours. Now he had to get his survivors out alive. Withdrawal under pressure is the nightmare scenario for any commander. Infantry retreating whilst maintaining cohesion, cavalry covering flanks, artillery providing fire support whilst themselves pulling back, each element dependent on the others, any breakdown inviting catastrophe. French forces, sensing Allied retreat, would pursue aggressively, seeking to turn withdrawal into rout. This was precisely when casualty rates spiked, when organized armies dissolved into panicked mobs hunted by cavalry. The Allied commander designated de Souza's artillery as rearguard, the final element covering everyone else's retreat. It was recognition of their effectiveness and a death sentence if executed poorly. Rearguard artillery had to leapfrog backward, some guns covering whilst others limbered and withdrew, maintaining continuous fire to discourage French pursuit. One mistake in timing meant guns overrun, crews captured or killed. Allied infantry began pulling back from their positions in organized sequence. Austrian battalions withdrew first, marching north toward river crossings that would take them out of Masséna's reach. Portuguese infantry followed, maintaining formation discipline despite exhaustion. French forces, seeing the movement, surged forward. This was their chance to transform stalemate into victory through pursuit. De Souza split his 5 remaining guns into 2 elements. 3 pieces occupied a ridgeline position, loaded with the last canister rounds. 2 guns limbered immediately and withdrew half a mile to a secondary position. The 3-gun battery fired into advancing French infantry, buying time with their final ammunition. Then, as French forces closed to dangerous proximity, those 3 guns limbered and galloped back whilst the 2-gun battery opened fire from its position, continuing the covering fire without pause. This leapfrogging withdrawal, alternating positions, maintaining fire whilst moving backward, was textbook rearguard action executed with precision that belied the crew's exhaustion. French pursuit slowed, officers reluctant to press against artillery that remained dangerous despite retreat. Masséna's caution, learned through the day's painful lessons, now worked in de Souza's favor. French commanders advanced methodically, deploying artillery before each movement, refusing to rush into potential ambushes. The Portuguese guns fell back through the afternoon, firing their last rounds from a succession of delaying positions. Each discharge was calculated for maximum psychological effect, canister into pursuing columns at ranges that inflicted casualties and reinforced French hesitation. When ammunition finally exhausted completely, the guns withdrew at maximum speed, relying on remaining horse teams to outrun French pursuit. By evening, the Allied force had successfully disengaged. Austrian and Portuguese infantry reached river crossings and defensive positions beyond French reach. Casualties during withdrawal were remarkably light, perhaps 200 total, far below the catastrophic losses that usually accompanied retreat under pressure. De Souza's rearguard action had prevented Masséna from achieving the pursuit annihilation that could have destroyed the Allied force entirely. Final accounting of the day's work showed the impossible had been achieved. An Allied force of 4,000 had faced Masséna's 40,000 for 8 hours, inflicted disproportionate casualties, delayed French operations significantly, and withdrawn intact. French casualty reports suggested between 1,800 and 2,000 killed and wounded. Allied losses numbered approximately 600, with artillery casualties particularly heavy. De Souza had lost 7 of his 12 guns and nearly half his crews. For Masséna, the day represented frustration rather than defeat. He'd won the field, but failed to destroy his objective. His report to Napoleon acknowledged unexpectedly effective resistance from Allied artillery and noted delays in securing the sector. The Emperor, arriving days later, would not be pleased with anything less than decisive victory. For the Allied cause, the battle was an unqualified success. Time purchased, French corps bloodied, Allied army preserved. Austria's campaign could continue. Portuguese military credibility was established beyond doubt. And somewhere in the retreating column, Thomas de Souza cleaned his surviving guns and wondered if anyone would remember what 12 Portuguese cannon had accomplished against 40,000 Frenchmen. Thomas de Souza survived the battle and the retreat, though historical records offer frustratingly sparse details about his immediate fate. Portuguese military archives suggest he received promotion to major within months, recognition from both Portuguese and Austrian commands for his artillery tactics during the engagement. British observers attached to Allied headquarters filed reports praising the exemplary conduct of Portuguese artillery, and specifically noting the innovative mobile battery tactics that had stymied French numerical superiority. The Austrian government awarded decorations to several Portuguese officers, including de Souza, acknowledging their contribution to buying time that allowed Austrian forces to regroup. In Lisbon, the Prince Regent, governing from exile in Brazil, issued commendations for Portuguese troops serving in the Fifth Coalition, though specific individuals were rarely named in official proclamations. De Souza's later career remains partially documented. Records indicate he continued serving in Portuguese artillery through the Peninsular War's later campaigns, possibly participating in Wellington's eventual offensive operations. Portuguese artillery batteries would fight at Busaco, Albuera, and other major engagements, consistently earning praise for technical proficiency and steady conduct under fire. Whether de Souza personally commanded at these battles is unclear. Portuguese military records were partially lost during subsequent political upheavals. What's certain is that the battle's tactical lessons propagated through Allied armies. The concept of mobile artillery, shifting guns rapidly between positions to create impression of greater strength, appeared in subsequent Austrian and British tactical manuals. Wellington himself, commanding in Spain, experimented with flexible artillery deployment that echoed de Souza's improvised tactics. The idea that a small number of well-handled guns could achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers became accepted doctrine. For Portuguese military reputation, the engagement had outsized impact. Portugal was a small nation, recently occupied, often dismissed by major powers as a minor player. Portuguese troops fighting alongside Austrians and proving effective challenged those assumptions. British advisers like Beresford pointed to engagements like this when arguing for continued investment in Portuguese military reform. By 1810-1811, Portuguese divisions would serve integrated into Wellington's army, treated as equals to British regulars, a transformation partially built on credibility earned against Masséna's corps. The battle itself faded quickly from popular memory, overshadowed by larger, more decisive engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. No major history books detailed it. No paintings commemorated it. Unlike Waterloo or Austerlitz, this wasn't a battle that changed empires or ended wars. It was a delaying action, tactically successful, but strategically minor. Exactly the kind of engagement that gets footnoted then forgotten. This historical amnesia reflects broader patterns in how we remember warfare. Dramatic last stands like Thermopylae or Rorke's drift capture imagination Because they're comprehensible narratives. Doomed heroes fighting to the last. Brilliant defensive victories that achieve objectives through technical excellence are harder to mythologize. There's no glorious death, no tragic finale. Just professionals doing difficult jobs superbly well, then withdrawing to fight another day. The human cost deserves acknowledgement. De Souza's gun crews suffered roughly 50% casualties, 75 men killed or wounded from 150 engaged. These were skilled artillerymen, trained over months or years, representing significant investment in expertise. Their families in Portugal received meagre pensions, if anything. Their names appear in no monuments. Yet their achievement was remarkable by any measure. 12 guns against a corps, 10-to-1 odds, 8 hours of sustained action, and mission accomplished. Technical brilliance, physical courage, and desperate improvisation had defeated numerical superiority. Forgotten by history, perhaps. But they'd proven something essential. Small nations and skilled soldiers could stand against empires when competence and courage aligned. The question is whether we'll let that lesson remain forgotten. The story of Thomas de Souza and his 12 Portuguese guns against Masséna's 40,000 veterans distills lessons that transcend one April day in Bavaria. At its core, this was a triumph of technical expertise over brute force, of calculated risk over cautious doctrine, of professional competence over numerical superiority. These principles remain relevant wherever capable people face overwhelming odds. The tactical innovation, mobile artillery creating the illusion of greater strength, represented genuine military genius born from desperate necessity. De Souza hadn't read about these tactics in manuals because they didn't exist in written doctrine. He improvised based on understanding artillery's mathematical principles and recognizing that positioning mattered more than numbers. Modern military forces still study this concept. Concentrate force at decisive points, create uncertainty through mobility, use terrain and timing to multiply effectiveness. The specifics change. GPS-guided shells replace cannonballs, helicopters replace horse teams, but fundamentals endure. Leadership under pressure defines this engagement as much as tactical brilliance. Artillery officers needed mathematical aptitude, certainly, but de Souza demonstrated something beyond calculation: the ability to make split-second decisions whilst surrounded by chaos and death. Concentrating all guns on the breakthrough point violated standard practice but saved the line. Adopting mobile tactics exhausted crews but prevented annihilation. Each decision balanced risk against necessity, expertise against desperation. That's leadership, not heroic speeches, but cold assessment of terrible options and choosing the least terrible. The David versus Goliath narrative resonates because it challenges the assumption that size determines outcomes. 4,000 troops shouldn't hold against 40,000. 12 guns shouldn't stop an entire corps. Mathematics says overwhelming force wins. Yet here, competence and courage rewrote the mathematics. This matters because it reveals that material advantages aren't absolute. Skill, positioning, morale, and leadership create variables that pure numbers don't capture. Underdogs can win, not through miracles, but through excellence executed under pressure. Portugal's contribution to defeating Napoleon deserves recognition beyond this single engagement. Portuguese forces fought throughout the Peninsular War, suffering casualties, holding lines, executing operations that allowed Wellington's eventual victory. Their footnotes in most histories, overshadowed by British and Spanish forces. Yet without Portuguese divisions trained to British standards, the Peninsular Campaign's outcome might have differed. Small nations' contributions to great events matter, even when forgotten. The intellectual demands of artillery warfare, mathematics, physics, chemistry, engineering, remind us that warfare isn't just courage and killing. Gun crews calculated trajectories, measured powder charges, adjusted for wind and temperature. Officers like de Souza needed education as much as bravery. Military history too often celebrates cavalry charges over the unglamorous competence of technical specialists. Yet technical specialists win wars. Artillerymen, engineers, logisticians. These are the professionals who transform courage into victory. Perhaps most importantly, this story exemplifies courage redefined. De Souza wasn't charging with sword drawn or leading desperate bayonet assaults. He was calculating angles whilst cannonballs killed his crews, making mathematical decisions whilst everything urged panic. That's courage too, the cold discipline to think clearly when thinking clearly is nearly impossible. These lessons deserve preservation. Technical expertise defeats numerical superiority when brilliantly applied. Leadership means making terrible decisions well. Small contributions to great causes matter. Intellectual courage equals physical courage. Competent professionals can achieve the impossible. If you found this forgotten story compelling, share it in the comments. What other unknown heroes deserve recognition? Hit that like button if you believe these stories matter. And subscribe, because history is filled with extraordinary people whose names we've forgotten but whose achievements shaped our world. Sometimes 12 guns can stop 40,000 men. We should remember how and why and who made it happen.